summer is here finally, and I mean, it is hot, right? For me, summer is not my favorite time of the year. I actually prefer fall because it's the football weather and all that stuff, and it's just the right weather. Okay, so I got some fall people out there with me. Good to know. But my wife, I know that she prefers the summer, and I have to tell you, when I'm going through the winter months, I really cannot wait for summer to get here because I need the warmth and all that goes along with it. And so, but even though I can't wait for summer to get here, I also sort of have this loathing as well because I've recognized that my summer body is not in the place it needs to be, and so when people talk about laying out or going to the pool and stuff, I'm thinking I will scare small children if I get in my bathing suit, So I tend to stay away from this. The other thing I noticed is that I also want to get out and play ball with the guys at the church. And luckily I have an excuse now because we have so many games going on with our own kids that I can't get to the ball field. But I also recognize that's a problem as well because I know that I could still hit the ball and I could probably make it to first, but you better have an oxygen tank by the time I get there because I'm going to need some help. So I recognize that sort of everything I did in the winter was probably not in the best use of my time. I realized I've sat around a lot, probably ate more than I should, not exercised well enough. And so, here's sort of the body that I'm stuck with. And so I sort of go to this phase like, oh man, I wish I would have taken time to shape up. And so all of a sudden summer becomes that time when, okay, we got to walk more, we got to eat better, we got to try to get in some type of shape that's better for me. I think that the parallel for me would be this, is I think that we also need to look at our lives spiritually at times as well and see sort of where we're at. I think that there are times that we go through sort of the motions of things and we get out of some of the habits that we're used to, whether it be our time in the Word or our time in prayer or making sure that we're connecting in a church service in some way. I think we get to the place where distractions sort of come in and we no longer have our focus on God anymore, and then our lives sort of start unraveling in different ways because we've allowed everything else to sort of prioritize in our life, and we become to the place where we basically get spiritually unfit, that we have to get to the place where we have to sort of recognize that we need to you got two choices, either you shape up or you ship out. And so we decided to develop a series then based off of that, in which we're calling Summer Shape Up. The idea is for us to sort of look at disciplines or things in our lives and say, okay, what could we do differently in order to get sort of on the right track spiritually? And so we're hoping over the next several weeks you'll stick with us and you can apply some of these sort of basic truths. We're going to give you assignments every once in a while or things we want you to do at home and things we want you to put in practice to see if one of these will become sort of a healthy habit for you and get you to the place that you want to be spiritually. So today we're going to look at the idea of first our goals. And again, so we'll get into the scriptures in a minute, but I want to give you a story about a guy I've never heard of. Maybe some of you know about this individual, and I may butcher his name, but we'll go with this. It says, Kareli, a Hungarian trained for many years, and he had one single dream, that he wanted to make his hand the best shooting hand in the world and win the Olympics. He was a great shooter and had won many competitions. 2 years before the Olympics, in 1938, there was an army camp that was going on, and Kareli was in the Hungarian army, and so he was part of the camp. During the practice session, he went through an accident. A hand grenade exploded in his right hand. He lost his hand in the dream of becoming the best shooter in the world. His dream at the moment was shattered to pieces. A big decision came to him when he was in the hospital for a while. At the time, he began to think through things, and he thought, I've got one of two choices. I can either be depressed about not making my goal, or I can train my other hand to become the best shooter in the world. He decided to keep his goal, so he decided to focus. He decided that he would not focus on what he had lost, his right hand, but he decided that he would focus everything on his left hand. Kareli didn't lose hope. He was much too focused that he decided mentally to begin preparing himself, and that once he got out of the hospital, he would begin to practice and he wouldn't tell anyone. This same hand that he couldn't write with was the hand that he was going to shoot with. He stayed in the hospital for 2 months after the accident, and after 1 month after discharge from the hospital, he started practicing with his left hand. After 1 year of training in 1939, a national championship was occurring in Hungary. Many pistol shooters were also present at the event. When the people in the event saw him, they met him, praised him about his bravery. All the athletes went out to congratulate him and said, "This is what true sportsmanship is all about." Even though he had lost his right hand, he still turned up to the event to see the other pistol shooters participate and to inspire the other sportsmen. He replied to the others, "I didn't come here to encourage or inspire you guys. I came here to compete." All the other shooters present at the event were competing with their best hand, but Carolee was competing with his only hand. After the event, guess who won? The man with only one hand, Carolee. But he didn't stop there. He knew his goal was clear. He knew that he wanted to make his hand the best hand in the whole world. So he shifted all of his focus towards the 1940 Olympics. But unfortunately, due to the outbreak of World War II, the Olympics were canceled. So he shifted all of his focus towards the 1944 Olympics. And again, those Olympics were canceled because of the war. So he shifted all of his focus towards the 1948 Olympics as he was growing older. He was at the age of 38 now. That year, he had a bunch of youngest and most talented shooters around the world. All those young players were competing with their best hand, but Carolee was the one competing with his only hand. And guess what? He won the 1948 Olympics gold medal. And the title was The Man with the Only Hand, Carolee. But then he also didn't stop again. So in 1952 Olympics, he again entered the competition. And guess who won again? Carolee. He changed the whole history of the Olympics. In that particular competition of pistol shooting, nobody had ever won 2 consecutive gold medals in the consecutive Olympics. Carolee was great. Carolee had accomplished his goal. We talked a little bit about Paul last week. Paul, whose name was Saul, was known for persecuting Christians early on. But he had an experience with Jesus Christ that totally changed his life. He went from persecuting and trying to make things difficult on Christians to the place that he decided that he would start leading Christians and that he would start leading the churches, and he began writing to them. Matter of fact, most of the New Testament, the way we have it, was written by Paul. And in the passage of Scripture we're going to give you today, just like Carolee, Paul had a goal that had changed his life, and he was going after that. So let's read together 1 Corinthians 9, 24 through 27. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body, and I make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. Let's pray together. Father, as we have read in your word, we are in awe of the things that you list and the things that you give us and the detail in which you speak into our lives. I pray that in this moment of time, that we would be free from distractions, that we would listen to your word, that we would soundly apply it to our lives. And if there are areas in our life where we need to change, maybe we would be reflective on it and decide to make changes. And so we give you this time. Father, I ask that your voice would be heard instead of mine. In your name we pray. Amen. As I was looking at the ideas of goals and I was looking at this passage, there were sort of 5 things I wanted to give you today, or 5 takeaways I wanted you to have. And they all begin with the letter D, and pretty much because that's my average grade in high school. Not really. I was more of a C student, okay? But I want to give you some of these. I want to give you some of these different things. So first, let's start with this. When looking at goals, I want us to define and decide the goal. Paul says the goal of every runner is to what? It's to win the race, or it's to get the prize. It's a sort of lose or win situation. It's not like in our day and age where everyone who sort of competes gets some sort of trophy or some sort of prize, and we recognize sort of the work and talent and everything you put into it. This was in a time where like only the winner was ever recognized. You would only remember the winner. And it's sort of like our day and age when we have like major competitions, we always remember the winner, and oftentimes we'll forget even who took second place, because the winner is what really mattered. And in this day and age, they were big on the games, and the running these races and competitions were significantly important to them. So Paul says this to us. He says, so we need to define and decide what the goal is. So at the end of the race, or at the end of my time of training and taking care of my body and getting to the place where I can be, at the end of this time, what did they want? They wanted that wreath. And they wanted to wear it on their head, and they wanted everyone to know that this is the winner of the competition. And so for them, the defining goal was the wreath, to finish first. You see, a goal for them was very measurable. It should be beneficial. It should challenge you. You need to define what a goal is and then go for it. I was using this illustration this morning. This illustration was actually given to me, by the way, from Pastor Beers. But one of the things he would often say when he was a pastor, he would say that sometimes we are sort of like the Peanuts cartoon, and they have there's this character that he shoots an arrow. And as he shoots an arrow and it sort of hits the wall, he goes up after it and he takes a can of paint and he paints the bullseye right where the arrow landed. And he says, this way I always hit the target. Yeah. And I think for many of us, we sort of do that. We sort of say, okay, that was my target, after it was all said and done. And what Paul was saying is look, go ahead and define what your goal is. And once you define what your goal is, then decide to go after it and make sure that it's measurable, make sure it's mentionable, and that you can challenge yourself, and that it's beneficial to you, and that you can get there. So define your goal and decide to go for it. Some of you will say, my goal, for example, would be to lose weight. Then put down the weight that you want to lose, or put down the weight that you want to get to, and then decide to go for it. Some of you will say, I want to do a better job of parenting. Then define what being a better parent is all about. For some of you, you might say, for me, being a better parent is spending more time with my kids. Well, then define what that time looks like. Is it an hour with each kid individually? Is it a half hour? What is that time, and what are you going to be doing about it? And define it, and then decide to go after it. Some of you would say that it's my marriage, that I want to have a better marriage, or I want to be a better spouse. And I want to stop for just a minute. I want to talk to married couples in this congregation. Over the last week, I've been approached by 5 different individuals who'd say that my marriage is falling apart and I don't know what to do. You see, I have seen over and over again that Satan is attacking our marriages. Our failed marriages have a long-lasting impact, whether we admit it or not. It divides a household. And in Mark 3:25, Jesus tells us that a divided house cannot stand. In other words, it crumbles and it leaves a pile of rubbish that is hard to repair. We'll mention several goals today, but the problem and what's different about a marriage goal is this. And listen up, all couples. The goal in a marriage cannot be done by just one individual, can it? But you have to have both of you sort of buy into the process that we're going to make this work because it matters. And I think we have too many people and too many relationships where one says, I'm going to work at it, and the other will say, I'm just done. I'm just not going to do that. I was driving down our road, and like I often do when I go home, obviously, and I often look around. I like to see what's going on, and I'm always impressed by one of my neighbor's yard. I mean, it is just always sort of immaculate. They cut their grass very well, probably a couple times a week. They fertilize it. There's no sort of weeds on it. It just has that nice green look to it. And I often will sort of get embarrassed because sometimes I don't always have the time that I want, or I just can't get to it right now, and somebody else has called me up to do something else, and I never get to my yard. And I always think, boy, I really wish I had the time to make my yard look like their yard looks. But what's been funny in the last, not funny, it's sort of tragic, but in the last month, what I've noticed is this, is that now I drive past this neighbor's yard, and because of how low it sits, it's almost like a bowl that's been filling up with water from all the rain. And now every time I drive past this person's yard, guess what? It's not green. It's brown. And what I've decided is, I don't really want that yard after all. I'm okay with my yard. And I think that in relationships and talking about couples, I think sometimes we can look at something and say the grass is always greener on the other side until a flood comes and then destroys it. And I think that we have to be people who are willing to say, you know what? I want to fight for these things. I'm going to define what my goal is in marriage, and I'm going to decide as a couple to go after it. I'm hoping sometime in the next year to probably do a whole series on marriages, but for right now, I just want to leave you with that. For some of you, the goal is to become a better Christian. For Paul, the same was true. You see, he defined his goal as leading others to Christ. That's why he takes the sort of previous passages of Scripture and he talks about winning those who are unlike him and becoming like them, because he recognizes that there is a need to love people and to bring them into the kingdom. So Paul begins to identify what being a good Christian is all about. Matter of fact, if you would break it down for Paul, Paul would say this. Paul was a believer in God. All right? He just wasn't a believer in Christ. And he went after it passionately. But when Paul had an experience with Christ, it totally changed his trajectory in life. He decided to live differently and to become a new person. And so what Paul would describe is for you this, is Paul would say it really comes down to sort of the commandments. And the commandments say, and Jesus broke it down this way, the two greatest commandments are what? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And Paul would identify with that. He would say, I am one who wants to love God the best that I can. But then the second part is what? Is to love others as ourselves. In other words, I want to define what being a better Christian is, making sure that I'm in the right place and that I bring others along with me as well. Matter of fact, if you even look at the end of the scripture text there, he says, I want to make sure that I run in such a way that I'm not only training others, but I myself may not be disqualified from the race. So he wants to bring others as well, but he wants to make sure that his own life is intact the way it needs to be. And I think how many times we as individuals say we want to be a better Christian, and we may sit here in the services and we may listen, we may get involved in small groups, we may take time turning on the Christian radio stations when we can, and listening to all things about God. But one of the problems is we may try to love God as much as we can, but we sort of forget to do the other part sometimes, don't we? We sort of forget to live it out. It's almost like we just go through the motions. There's an illustration that I want to give you, and it's this, that in football, which is one of my favorite sports, they have what they call the huddle. Sort of where the offensive guys get together and they sort of corral, and someone put their arms around each other, some get into certain stances, and they sort of get in this circle and they begin to talk about their next play. Like, here's what we're going to do, and here's how we're going to get past the opposition. And their goal was to what? Their goal is to get a good play, to get more yardage, that they may eventually get to the end zone and get 6 points, and then maybe 7 points after they score again. So that's what their goal is, and they're looking to sort of get in that direction. Now, if you were watching this huddle, and that's all they did, what would that game feel like? Like they just never ran a play. They just always got together and said, we're going to huddle up, we're going to talk about the play, but we're never going to run it because we can't figure out what to do. How boring would that game be? All of the fans on the sideline would be going crazy. They wouldn't want to go to these events or games or anything like that. And for Christianity, listen, there are some times that we spend so much time huddling together that we never accomplish anything out there in the community. You see, God has specifically put you in different places than me so that you and I together, when we come into these huddling moments, we may come up with a strategy in which we can win the kingdom for Christ. So it's not just about loving God, it's about loving others as well and bringing them. And that's what Paul was trying to get at. So he was saying, for me, defining the goal is not only to love God the best I can, but to love others as well. I've had some time to think about some of the goals that I see for our church. And I began to think about, what would make Dayspring become a better church. And so I've been trying to write things down, to think about things, to run by other people. And I know that part of it involves growing disciples. I know it's just not about transfer growth from other churches, but it's about converting people into the faith, finding people that are in sin and bringing them to Christ. I know it involves loving the unlovable. I know that it involves being in the world, but not of it. I'm so excited about tonight with Mega Sports Camp because it's one of the things that we are doing that the world esteems as valuable. And so we're going to concentrate a little bit on sports, but then we're going to introduce them to the gospel. Isn't that really cool? Like, we're going to have probably 200 kids that are going to come into this place and hear about Jesus Christ, all while playing something they do anyways. And that's pretty cool. And so I hope that as a congregation, we'll think of ways to say, okay, here's how we're going to define what Dayspring is going to look like in order that we might fulfill the Great Commission. Secondly is this, is not only do we need to define and decide that we're going to go through on a goal, but we need to discipline ourselves. Verse 25 says that everyone who competes in the games, and I want to focus on that word compete, because the word compete means to contend with dangers. It means that there are struggles that we're going to face, and it means that we're going to fight for what we really want. So if I think about that word compete, and I think about sort of the goals that I have defined and I have decided to go through with, what would my parenting look like if I understood the struggle, but decided to fight for my children anyways? What if I understood that spending time with them may cause me some pain and agony because they may not do things always the right way, they may make me angry at some times, but what if I decided that I'm going to fight for my time with them because that is important? What would that look like? What would our bodies look like if we decided that I need to lose weight, and so I know that the struggle is going to be hard. I know the exercising is going to be pressing on me. I know that I'm going to have pains. And I've just started this thing the other day that my accountability partner, Brian Shank, got me started on. And I had to do as many push-ups as I could in 2 minutes. And I did 50. And today my arms, they just don't want to move very high. Okay? They're just very sore. But what if I decided that I was going to fight for the idea to be more healthy and to lose weight? Like, how would that affect me? What would our marriages look like if we understood that we are going to have struggles in our relationships, and we understood that the struggle is real, but instead of fighting for our own rights, what if we started fighting for the rights of the other person? What would that look like if we as couples decided to outlove the other one? What would that look like? We began to fight for those things. What would it look like if we as Christians understood that there are going to be dangers in this life, but we are going to fight for our relationship with Christ, that we know that problems and circumstances beyond our control are going to happen, but we're going to fight and discipline ourselves for our relationship with Christ? What would it be like if we as a church understood that our will would get in the way of God's will? But what would change if we decided to fight for His will and unity in the church? What would that look like? Paul says knowing the struggle is real. And then he says on top of that, I decide to discipline my body. He expresses it in the form that he says that I beat my body into submission. He understands that winning the race is important. But even though that he's going to strive and going to push to win the race, he understands that I have to beat my body, and I'm going to go through all this pain right now, to where it even says that that word define means that I will beat my body till it's black and blue. So that way when I get into the race, it's not as difficult to do. One of the hardest things that I ever did in life was wrestling. My mom did not want me to wrestle. My dad decided one year I could wrestle, and so I did it. And it was the hardest thing that I ever did. I mean, compared to anything. And I remember going to my first practice and going to the practices after that, and they had different things that we had to do to get in shape. And one of the things that we had to do is we had to spend a ton of time running. And I kept thinking, why are we spending so much time running? We're just going to get on the ground and we're going to use our muscles and, and sort of go to battle with each other. But we would run and run and run. And in basketball, they used to do what they call these line drills. You know what a line drill is? Like you have a line on the floor there and you run to that line, you bend down. I can't bend down very easy anymore, but you touch that line and then you run back and you touch this line and then you run back here farther and you touch that line. And you have to touch each line on the basketball court. I went into a wrestling practice where we had to do line drills, but it was on the football field. And it wasn't just the every 5 yards. It was every hash mark we had to touch. And I remember going through a practice and thinking, I am done with this. And I thought I literally may die on this field. And they're going to have to name it the Chuck Osborne field because this is where he passed away. Because, it was just so intense. And then we got done with that. And then we would go into practice and we would throw each other around and wrestle. And then after that, we would go and lift weights. And I'm thinking, why are we doing all of this? And I can't remember what the time is. And somebody can correct me. Is it 3 minutes for a period or what is it? Somebody, Danica, help me out. Three? 3 minutes in a period, but you have to do 3 periods, right? And I thought, that's no big deal. Why are we doing all this? Then I got into my first wrestling match. Oh my goodness. We went to battle and I was thinking, I'm so out of shape. And we were done with the first period. Then we went to the second period. And again, I was like, are you kidding me? This is like the worst thing I've ever done. Then we went to the third period. And again, it was just this constant battle and struggle. And after 3 periods, after I had given my all, everything that I could, it was a tie. And what that meant is you had to go an extra period. And if there is still one thing that I am completely embarrassed about, I don't even like to share it because it just bothers me to this day. But when I heard we had 1 more period to go, I looked at the coach and said, there's no way. And I was just gasping and almost crying. I said, I can't do it, And so I forfeited the match. And so to this day, it bothers me. And I remember getting on the bus, and I remember hearing the 2 coaches sort of talk back and forth. They were asking about different players and all this stuff. And one of the coaches said, so, what do you think about so-and-so? And they were talking. And then they said, what do you think about Osborne? And the guy said, Osborne could be really good if he wasn't so lazy. And I'm telling you that it really, really, really affected me to the place where I said, I'm never going to give up on anything again because I always want to strive to do the very best that I can. And Paul was saying, look, all this pain, all the struggle you go through is so that when the struggles and the problems of life come, you have beaten yourself into the place that you know how to overcome them. So if I define my goal as being a better parent and I begin to discipline myself in those areas, then when the hard times come where my kids are making me upset, I have realized how I'm going to deal with that situation because I've already beaten my body to that place. In my marriage relationships, when I struggle to love that other person and we're having a rough day or a rough spell, you see, I've disciplined myself to the point where I say, I can overcome this because it's that important to me. I'm willing to fight for it. And on my relationship with Christ, we say, I discipline my body in order that I might not lose out on the prize. I'm willing to go through this pain and turmoil because when the struggles, when the hard times come, I will know how to overcome them. Those become very defining moments for us. See, there was a church that I was thinking about taking about 2 years ago. It was in Pinellas Park. They had called and asked if I would do an interview with them. And so me and my wife, we got down to like the final 2, and we flew over to Florida and thought for sure we were going to be going there. And we looked at this church, and this church had everything going for itself at one time. It had a sanctuary that held 1,700 people. And they had sort of all the lights and all the pyrotechnics and all that stuff before it was even cool. And it just looked like a beautiful place. But they had a parking lot of about 100. And I asked them, I said, how'd you get all those people into this place? Because they used to run that. I said, how'd you get all these people in this place? And they said, well, we had to park them over at the mall and we would bus them in. And so that's sort of how big this church was. And I asked them, I said, your church isn't that big anymore, right? And they said, no, we run about 250. And I said, what happened? And what they said is, and this will bring us to our next point, they said that our pastor who had really grown this church had an affair. And the church got decimated because of it. And I said, well, I'm surprised that, you guys weren't able to overcome that. And they said, we brought the next guy in and he had an affair as well. And so we went even in half again. And what I realized is this. That church had no idea how to contend with the struggle and with the pressure when it came up. But what if you and I were willing to fight and discipline ourselves, that we say when these problems come, when these situations come, we're going to know how to deal with it so it doesn't affect God's bride? What would that look like? It leads us to the next thing, and that's this. And this is where these guys could have solved a lot of things. We need to watch out for distractions, and we need to avoid them. We can become distracted and we can look away from the goal of becoming like Christ, and it can affect us in some huge ways. I don't know how many of you have ever seen the movie Chariots of Fire, but every time I think of that song, I think of da-na-na-na-na-na, and these guys running through the water in slow motion, and the tears in my eyes start to well up. I'm like, oh my goodness, these guys are so disciplining themselves for this great race and all this, so they're running in that slow motion and stuff, and one of the runners there is a great runner named Abraham, and he had won so many races, and his coach had really held him to like a strict disciplinarian. And he finally lost one of the races because of this. He looked to the side. Just as he was about to finish the race, he looked to see where his competitor was. His coach said to him, "That cost you the race." He was not single-minded on just finishing in the prize, but he was worried about all the other stuff that was going on around him, and he got very distracted. One of the things that Paul talks about is going into strict training. Other translations call it exercising your body. And what that word means there is to be self-controlled. It's not only about training and to make sure that we're giving our all in exercise, but it's about being self-controlled to the place where we say, there are certain things that we're not going to allow to happen because we know that they can become distractions for us. So the runners, when they were competing for the games, one of the things that they would do is they would refrain from certain things. So there were certain foods that they would not take into their body because they knew that it would slow them down and that it wouldn't give their body the muscle that it needed. They would also, coming up to the race, refrain from wine because they thought if they drank too much wine, it would begin to affect their body. And then if they got drunk, they might, begin partying, and then, who knows what kind of trouble they could get into. So they decided to refrain from that. And then, again, they also refrained from sex as well because they believed that these were considered distractions in order that they might lose the race if their sort of focus was on other things. And so what Paul talks about is he talks about strict training in that we say, I want to be self-controlled in areas. And I wonder for us what it would look like if we're self-controlled. Paul talked about this, or when we were talking about the fruits of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, and all that stuff, patience. What's the last thing that he ends with? He talks about being self-controlled. He talks about being self-controlled. And so if I come to the place where I want to lose weight, I understand that I have to be self-controlled in that there are certain food items that I cannot have because that means I'll have to do more exercise in order to get rid of that, right? And if I would say in parenting that I want to love my children more and I want to be a better parent, there are times that I have to be self-controlled, and that there are sometimes I don't get good enough sleep, and so I may start to get a little bit upset with my kids when they start doing things that I consider stupid, which are probably doesn't matter at all. But I find myself getting upset, and so I have to self-control myself. There are times in our marriages, in our relationships, there are things that are very distracting to us. They can be things like other people listening to us and making us feel good about ourselves. They can be things such as pornography. They can be things such as cheating on the other spouse. You see, these things become distractions from what is really important. And if I say I'm going to discipline my body, I also have to say that I'm going to be self-controlled to where I don't let these distractions take over so that I can work on my marriage, I can work on my kids, I can work on my weight. And then the distractions in being a Christian can be little things that really don't matter. Somebody says an unkind word to us and it affects us. We lose our job. We have a family situation that's beyond our control. These can become distractions. They can be distractions just as sports or other activities that we have that may take the priority of God. These can be things that distract us away from God, and then God has a problem speaking to us because we're not willing to listen because we're getting involved with all these other things. But what are those distractions that are keeping you from being self-controlled to the place where you say, I'm willing to give God my all? And even in the church, we can get distracted with all kind of other things that we can miss the part about reaching out to people and loving people the best that we can. Because we can get so busy with other things. You see, when we get rid of the distractions and when we discipline our body, what I find is this, is that it begins to lead us to the place where we sort of develop the new you. Paul says this, he says that I beat my body to the place that I make it a slave. And what he's talking about, he says, I basically come to the place where I beat my body enough that I have mastered it. To the place where like distractions and other things can come in my way, but I have mastered it to the point that I'm sort of free from those things. I can overcome those situations because I've been developing a new me. And so that if I'm trying to lose weight and I've gotten sort of a new lifestyle, some of those foods that I used to be tempted by, I'm no longer tempted by because I developed a new me. And processing with my kids and wanting to love them more, if I'm developing myself and I beat my body and I become a master over it, I say my kids are now important and those other things that are distracting, such as work, such as other things that are going on, I no longer have to do those things because my concentration is on my kids. Same is true of a spouse. I'm no longer distracted by those things because I've built up to the place where I say my marriage is important and I love my wife and she loves me and we're going to make sure that we prioritize this thing, and we've mastered over these other things that when influences or pressures or temptations come in, we say no to them because I've become a master of my own situation and I developed into a new me. And as a Christian, I respond to things differently. I look at the world differently. Things that once bothered me, used to bring me down, no longer do because I've become a master over my body with the help of Christ who has trained me. And I can no longer sort of give in to the same temptations, and I can look at people differently, and I have become a new me. So what would the new you look like? Because what I found is that when we beat our bodies and we train ourselves in the way we need to go, what happens is things become a little bit easier. When I get more into exercising, what I found is that I can run to first and not need the oxygen tank. When I find that I have responded differently in the Christian walk, that the things I used to get upset by no longer upset me like they once did because there's a new me. And I'm living for an audience of one. And lastly is this. Is when you begin to develop the new you, then I want to tell you to be done. And be okay. Because you got the prize that you went after. In college, James Dobson's goal, if you know James Dobson, he's the Focus of the Family guy that many of you probably know, some of you may not, but he focuses on the family and sort of what the benefits are and how to raise your children and be invested in your spouse's life. But his goal was to become the school's tennis champion. He felt proud when his trophy was prominently placed in the school's trophy cabinet. Years later, someone mailed him that trophy. They had found it in a dustbin when the school was renovated. He said, given enough time, all your trophies will be trashed by someone else. People fail to realize that over time, all achievements will be eventually surpassed. Records will be broken. These are the crowns that don't last, but we want goals that will last forever. When the runners were given a prize, what were they given? They were given a wreath. And that wreath would eventually just die. And he says all these runners train for these purposes just to get a temporary trophy. But see, you and I have things that are far more important, don't we? You and I have some goals that have eternal value, and they really matter. And these are the things that will last forever. Paul says, I run in such a way that I don't want to be disqualified from the race. I not only coach people, but I'm going to live life the way I want to as well. You know why the prize really matters for me, and what I really love about God is this. I've been around people long enough that I've seen some pretty messed up situations. I'm always amazed at people that lose weight and are able to transform their bodies and, make a big deal about it. But I'm also amazed about parents who have had struggles with their kids and have just sort of been at their wits' end, and their kids have made some pretty poor decisions. But yet something happens and that relationship turns around and God gets a hold of them and it works. I've witnessed marriages that have been at wits' end, even in my own family, to where I thought this is never going to be reconciled. And I've seen the way that God's intervened and moved. I've seen people who had no idea who Christ was. They had addiction problems. They had problems loving their family. They were just in so much sort of sin and bad places. And yet I've seen God get a hold of their lives and totally transform them. And even as I was preparing this message, this song that kept playing over the radio that I kept listening to over and over again and got emotional as I was listening to it. It's by Elevation Worship, and it says, "Do it again." And what the song says, I've seen you move. You move the mountain. And I believe I'll see you do it again. You made a way when there was no way. And I'll see you do it again. Your promise still stands. Great is your faithfulness. I'm still in your hands. This is my confidence. You never fail. You see, I've seen God move mountains in people's lives. And just like I've seen Him do it in theirs, I know that He can do it in yours as well. God makes a way when there seems to be no way. I told you that I had 5 different individuals come up to me about their marriages. I announced this morning that I thought it was interesting. At 5 in the morning, I got a Facebook message for a couple I'd been praying for. And the guy said, my wife and I have decided to stick it out. And we're on a new trajectory. And then after the first service, another couple came up to me and said, you've been praying for us. And I want to thank you and your staff, because we pray for a lot of things here at the church. So I want to thank you and your staff because my husband and I have decided to make things work. You see, God has moved mountains in people's lives, and He can do it in yours.